But we begin with the political career of Desmond O'Malley to mark the publication of his long-awaited memoir, Conduct Unbecoming, published by Gillan Macmillan. O'Malley was founder of the Progressive Democrats, whose stance on the liberal agenda on the economy and on Northern Ireland marked them off from Fianna Fáil. But ironically, in the lifetime of the PDs, Fianna Fáil converged towards what had been O'Malley's 1980s positions in all of these policy areas. Desmond O'Malley was sometimes called the best leader and Taoiseach that Fianna Fáil never had. He was an influential and controversial politician since his arrival in the Dáil in 1968, the winner of a by-election for Fianna Fáil, which followed the early death of his uncle, Donogh O'Malley.
I started as a solicitor and, I spent whatever it was, 8 years, I think, practising. And it was interesting and, you get all tied up in it, and I'm sure I'd have spent the rest of my life in it, but looking back on it now, I'm sure I'd have inevitably been very bored. I went from a low-key kind of pretty private type of profession into a very high-visibility one. And then I found myself right in the middle of many of the storms that went on over 3 decades in that. So at least, as the Chinese say, I lived in interesting times.
The title of Des O'Malley's autobiography is Conduct Unbecoming. This is taken from the charge made against him by Fianna Fáil when he was being expelled from the party, when Charles Haughey was leader.
In the opinion of the National Executive, he has been guilty of conduct on becoming a member of the organisation.
And we'll consider that later, but that gives Desmond O'Malley the title to this autobiography, which has been written over a considerable period and, of course, includes his boyhood in Limerick.
Limerick was a small city with a good sense of community, in which a huge number of people knew a high proportion of other people there, of the remainder of the population. It would be wrong to say that it was a classless society, because there were great differences, if you like, I suppose, financially and socially. But it was a society or a community in which all classes mixed freely in a way that you wouldn't get in Dublin, for example. And you would actually know a lot of people who, lived in very difficult circumstances. One of the unifying factors, I think, curiously, was the game of rugby. It brought all Limerick together in a way that there was no other unifying factor as strong as it.
Olivia O'Leary asked him about Limerick's reputation as a conservative city, the confraternity, the expectation of conformity to strict Catholic outlook.
The influence on mine would have been Jesuit, I think, because I was at a Jesuit school. And that was different. It was much more low-key. And but nonetheless, it still reflected the times that were in it. And both in Limerick and in Ireland, there was a certain intellectual imprisonment almost at that time. There were parameters of conduct, even of thought virtually, laid down for people that you had to stay within, and that was very, very stifling.
As for the political party he might join, were he to become a politician like his uncle Donogh O'Malley, there was no question about party affiliation. His father, a practising solicitor, was close to Fianna Fáil.
He had been mayor of Limerick twice, but he was friendly with both De Valera and Lemass, who seemed to value his views, because I can recall as a kid, Lemass in particular, ringing him up at home at night occasionally, and to ask him his views on, for example, a bill that they were proposing or something like that, as to how he thought it would work.
He was a solicitor, of course.
He was a solicitor, yeah. He always, when he was talking about departments and ministers, he used to talk about two which he used to think were very important. One was justice and the other was industry and commerce. And it was not terribly long after his death that I actually occupied both of those departments. And you'd always regret the death of your father, and especially a father that you got on very well with, but I particularly regretted that he wasn't there, because he'd have been a great help to me when I was in those departments, and especially in the first one when I was in Justice, and I was very young, and God, I was very green, It was very rough at that stage, because it was the things that were happening were not things that you could have learned about, because they were all happening for the first time. There were no precedents then, 1970, no precedents, and you were floundering a bit, and it was hard to keep your balance at times.
Olivia O'Leary asked him about the Fianna Fáil party as he found it in 1968, when elected in the by-election. Jack Lynch had been elected leader only 2 years before.
As a young TD, were you very conscious of the relationship between, say, people like Charles Haughey, Neil Blaney, and the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch? Was there a certain contemptuous attitude in their behaviour towards him?
I don't think they thought very highly of him. I think they thought that by voting for him or agreeing to his election in 1966, they were seeing him as a kind of an interim Taoiseach. They thought that he would be more malleable or more pliable than George Colley would. And they wanted to block Colley with what they thought was an easier man and an interim leader. And they began to up the ante on him in the late 60s. And I think they were taken aback to find that he reacted as firmly and as strongly as he did.
Taking that seminal event, which of course was the sacking of those ministers, Haughey and Blaney, and resignation of Boland, and eventually the arms trial, the question has always been raised as to whether, in fact, Jack Lynch knew that importation of arms was going on, and that at the last minute it suited him to pretend that he didn't. Was that the case?
No, it wasn't the case. He didn't know. And the fact that he didn't know was due, I think, primarily to a breakdown in the communications from the then Minister for Justice, who was my immediate predecessor, Micheál O'Moran.
You stepped in to Micheál O'Moran's shoes. You've said that it was a very difficult time because things were happening that had never happened before. What was your fear in terms of the threat that you obviously felt at that time?
You had the fear at times that the country could devolve down into some kind of civil war.
Really?
Yeah. The northern situation was appalling. It was out of hand. And the possibility of civil war was one that you could not rule out. And even if it stopped short of civil war, you had the possibility that there would be a major breakup in the government of the day, and perhaps somebody less stable than Lynch mightn't have been able to hold it together.
Acquitted in the arms trial, Charles Haughey bided his time, and by January 1975, with Fianna Fáil in opposition, he was appointed by Jack Lynch to the Fianna Fáil front bench.
And I, for one, had grave misgivings about it when it did happen. I wasn't consulted about it. I think Lynch's feeling was that he was prepared to give people the benefit of the doubt, that he was prepared to think the best of people.
But looking back now, and I know your admiration for Jack Lynch, and it's indeed widely shared, would you regard that decision as probably the biggest mistake he made in his political career, the decision to let Charles Haughey back on the front bench?
No, I can't think that you can't say that it was a mistake, unless you can chart out for me or for the public what the consequences the other way around would have been. Because one of the things that I'm conscious of, when a couple of years later, when it came to a decision when after Lynch had retired between Colley and Haughey, a number of people whom I thought, and various on our side of the fence thought, were going to vote for Colley ended up not doing so, and I said afterwards, in calmer moments to some of them, "You're believed to have voted for Haughey. How in the name of God could you have justified that?" And a number of them said to me, "If Haughey lost, he'd have burst up the party," to use Jerry Collins' subsequent phrase. He'd have broken it up, he'd have smashed it up. We knew that if Colley lost, he'd take his beating. He'd maybe crib about it, and he'd be sulky and maybe uncooperative, but he wouldn't set out to break it up. Haughey would have. And I said, my God, isn't that an appalling reason for having voted for someone that you know is the wrong person?
Fianna Fáil was a deeply divided party under Charles Haughey, who became leader in December 1979. He lost office to Garret Fitzgerald in 1981, regained it in the February 1982 election, only to lose it again to a Fitzgerald-led Fine Gael Labour coalition in November 1982. In opposition, the differences between Haughey and O'Malley within Fianna Fáil persisted until, as already recounted, O'Malley was expelled for conduct unbecoming. That was in 1985.
Well, the reason for my expulsion was that I was guilty of conduct unbecoming a member of the party.
The unbecoming conduct in question was abstaining on a bill introduced by Labour's Barry Desmond to liberalise the sale of contraceptives in early 1985. Fianna Fáil opposed the bill, but O'Malley, who had already lost the Fianna Fáil whip over his opposition to Charles Haughey's line on the New Ireland Forum report, now abstained on this vote. On the 26th of February, he was summoned to a party meeting at Fianna Fáil headquarters and charged with conduct unbecoming a member of the party.
The Fianna Fáil National Executive at its meeting tonight passed a motion by 73 votes to 9 as follows: that Des O'Malley TD be and hereby is expelled from membership of the organisation on the ground that he has been guilty of conduct unbecoming a member of the organisation.
Looking round me, I find it difficult to entirely accept that reason, because I think the question of conduct unbecoming membership of the Fianna Fáil organisation is a fairly subjective concept. It seems to be interpreted differently from time to time, and I can think of things that have happened that I think were perhaps a little less becoming than my alleged misconduct.
And then, no longer a member of Fianna Fáil, Des O'Malley spoke for the first time about the origin of the differences between himself and the party leader.
I don't think any difficulty started when I came into the Dáil 17 years ago. That would have been in 1968. But certainly difficulties arose in 1970 when some events happened then. I was Minister for Justice. I was appointed, in fact, just after the events had happened. And I came to know in some detail about those events and all the circumstances surrounding them. And I inevitably began to form certain opinions then, and quite honestly, those opinions really have never left me.
At that stage in 1985, there were many rumours about a new party being formed and that O'Malley should lead it. Initially, as you'll hear in this interview with Mike Murphy, he was cautious.
If there are aspects of any one party or any other party that they don't agree with, to seek to have policy changed, rather than to undertake the very difficult and perhaps certainly unguaranteed job of forming a new party. And that would be certainly the view that I would take.
Not long afterwards, he was encouraged to review that analysis and form the Progressive Democrats.
And I have been waiting for some sort of political messiah to come along, and he has come in the form of Des O'Malley.
And the people realise that the age of the giveaway is over.
The Progressive Democrats won 14 seats in their first election in 1987, but they won only 6 2 years later when Charles Haughey called a snap election in 1989. There was indecision following that election, and then there emerged a Fianna Fáil Progressive Democrat coalition.
We all had the same instinctive feeling, but we came to recognise reality. You can't throw back into the faces of the people the result of a general election just because you don't totally approve of that result yourself.
And in her interview with him after he had retired from politics, Olivia O'Leary asked him if he had any regrets.
Are you sorry that you never ran for leadership of Fianna Fáil? Would you like to have been Taoiseach?
I never wanted to be for the sake of it, insofar as I did make efforts in that direction. It was more to stop someone else rather than to have myself there. I'd have been perfectly happy to be number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 to someone else.
Why?
Like Jack Lynch.
Why?
Because I was happy in that situation.
Are you a natural number 2?
I think I'm a natural number 2 or 3 or whatever. I'm not someone that wants to push himself out into the public arena all the time. I value privacy, and that's why I found it difficult during a lot of that time to sort of live with the publicity that you had to live with.
But still, when you look back, if it hadn't perhaps been for Charlie Haughey, in time you might well have become leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach.
I might well have, but you would have had to sort of pay a price for it that it wasn't worth, really. And,
Like?
You'd have had to play the game as the boys wrote the rules, you know.
And you don't like that?
And I don't. I prefer to go by my own instincts. I made the mistake of thinking that the circumstances that led to, you know, the election of previous people in Fianna Fáil might continue, but that wasn't so. The rules changed utterly in the 1970s, and they're never going to change back, and I made the mistake of not recognising that soon enough, I think.
Desmond O'Malley, whose memoir, Conduct Unbecoming, has just been published by Gill and Macmillan.